Tune in weekly and listen to the Collateral Damage podcast, where Michael Wilson and Maureen Cavanagh host a variety of special guests to discuss topics and available services that will help you learn about the impact that substance use has on our lives, our families, and on our communities nationwide. Episodes and listening information can be found at www.cdpodcast.com. You can also search for Collateral Damage Podcast on your favorite listening platforms or watch previous and future episodes on YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe and share.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Collateral Damage. I'm Mike Wilson.
And I'm Maureen Cavanagh,
My amazing co-host. And today we have a special guest, Dan Perez, who is the author of As Needed for Pain. And Dan, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time to come onto our podcast and share some of your story with our listeners.
Thanks for having me. I'm grateful for the opportunity to come on and talk to you guys.
Appreciate that. So I got a chance to read a little bit. I printed some stories and got to explore a little bit about your experience. And based on what I read, you used to be, you were with Details magazine, is that right?
That's right. I was the editor-in-chief of Details magazine for 15 years.
Wow. Okay. And so you had, based on what I read, yours primarily started off as a prescription pill addiction. Is that correct?
Yes, and it pretty much stayed a prescription pill addiction.
Right.
I was, like so many people, unfortunately, in this country, I was prescribed prescription painkillers due to a back injury, like a fairly standard back injury, and a very standard surgery to correct that injury, and developed just what I would categorize as just a massive crippling addiction to opiates.
Right. And the reason I ask is because I hear that a lot. I'm in recovery myself, and my own addiction, there were prescription pills sprinkled in there, of course, some prescribed by doctors, some that I purchased elsewhere, but it was never just that. So I don't necessarily identify. And I like to hear about the other side of addiction. Basically, it was prescribed. I had someone giving it to me, and I was able to. When I was using OxyContin, when they came out early 2000s, I was on that. And when I was using those, even though they weren't prescribed, I still felt like my addiction was a different type of addiction while I was using them, because I was just using pills, and I felt different then. I felt like my addiction wasn't the same, and therefore I didn't need the same services or the same treatment. And I guess I can just imagine that as somebody that started with and ended with prescription pills, you probably fought that battle quite a bit with yourself, that, this is not addiction in the same sense of the word that somebody else is going through with heroin or other opiates.
100%. I had convinced myself that at times, let me say that at times I had convinced myself, because I would have sort of some moments of clarity sort of throughout where I would be like, wow, you're a drug addict. Mm-hmm. But I would work past those, pretty quickly. And this speaks to the power of the addiction, right? But I ultimately would find myself in a position where I would convince myself that I'm not really a drug addict. These are pills. Mm. This is something that's FDA approved, for God's sake. And I'm not out on the street, and I'm not, stealing or begging or doing anything. I'm, a high functioning individual. And this, I sold myself this bill of goods to help sort of justify my drug use. The reality, of course, as we all know, is that an addict is an addict is an addict, and it doesn't matter, whether you're wearing a suit and tie or don't have shoes on your feet. It really doesn't matter. Addiction doesn't discriminate in any way. But yes, I even write about that in the book. I write that, like, I was taking these pills and they were being prescribed and they were being filled in a pharmacy, and people with white lab coats were involved, and it was all like so, above board. But needless to say, I was seeing 5 different doctors and going to 5 different pharmacies, and ultimately even that, couldn't um, uh, meet the demand that I started to need, and so I then started to acquire them illegally.
Mm-hmm.
And you sober in 2007, right?
That's right,
Yeah.
October 2007.
So there was this whole you had a very glamorous career. I mean, this was like details was you were talking and mingling, and people. I read that you brought Anderson Cooper in. I mean, this was like for people that don't know Details magazine. This was a very, very glamorous career to be the editor-in-chief of this magazine.
Yes, it was an amazing opportunity, and it was a great career, and so I think looking at me from the outside, you would have seen someone that, at least maybe within the world of media, had a great job or even an enviable job, but on the inside, I was falling to pieces. I was falling apart. But yes, I was interacting with all sorts of really interesting cultural figures, and I think I actually thought, or maybe hoped, at least subconsciously, that sort of interaction in my life would validate me in a way that I needed to be validated, or would fill whatever hole I felt I had inside of me, and it didn't, obviously, and things like that seldom do. But I was since I was a young boy, had never, and this, we hear this, if a lot in recovery, never felt like I fit in, was never comfortable in my own skin, and I never really felt like one of the guys. And so I was sort of chasing shiny objects, basically, to try to help make me feel better. And ultimately, when I discovered Vicodin, that I thought at the time did make me feel better, and did make me feel whole, and did make me feel like me, or normal. Normal is a word that I come back to a lot in my book, because A, I never felt normal. B, I was often, people often said to me, "Hey man, this isn't normal." Like, I heard that a ton. And so normal is like a really interesting buzzword for me. But taking those pills for the first time after my back injury and surgery, I thought, was like coming home, and I thought it made me feel normal.
Yeah.
And what about the social side of that? I mean, was there a culture built into the magazine industry or the entertainment industry that reinforced what you were doing? I mean, did you find comfort socially with other people doing the same thing? I know
It was a different time too. I mean, we're talking about like the 90s and it was different at that
Right,
time. Yeah.
We're talking about the late 90s. Really, the addiction really kind of exploded for me in 2000. So between 2000 and 2007, when I got sober. But to circle back to your question, opiates tend not to be like a party drug, right? They sort of knock you out and numb you out. There were times, of course, throughout my years as an active addict, where I felt energized by them. In fact, I felt like I couldn't get out of bed without them.
Mm-hmm.
But I have never been a terribly social creature, and when these pills came into and ultimately took over my life, I isolated as often as humanly possible, because this was the most important relationship in my life. My relationship to these drugs was the only relationship I cared about, and I was quite willing to let any other relationship, whether it be with a family member or a romantic interest or colleagues, bosses, employees, whatever it was, I would let all those relationships go without any real regard, if I'm being honest, because the only relationship, my only priority were these pills.
Right. Well, I mean, the reason I ask is because, and it makes sense that, you know, with opiates, it's more of an isolating issue. It becomes a dominant relationship. You don't really share that with other people. But, you know, like in the NFL, like everybody knows that everybody's getting hurt and everyone's taking pills. Like in the entertainment industry or
Right.
you know, sales, everybody knows that, well, you know, the stress causes this. So here, why don't you take one of these? I'm taking these. And they kind of share these trade secrets to help you get through what you're getting through. And I wasn't sure if that was something that you experienced.
It wasn't. I did everything that I could to keep this a secret.
Yeah.
You know, and this is one of the curses of addiction. There are many, obviously, but you know, one of them, at least for me and in my experience, was this fear of discovery. You know, and that speaks to the stigma related to addiction. You know, I wanted to protect this secret because I was having my own little love affair with these drugs, and I didn't want anyone to know, anyone to interfere with that. When I got to a point several years into my addiction where I started to, in moments, recognize that I was a drug addict, I didn't have the courage to ask for help because of fear I had associated, and shame and embarrassment associated around the stigma of opiate addiction, or really any addiction, including alcoholism. So for me, one of the reasons I wrote my memoir, I wrote this book, was to help destigmatize this addiction and you know, share my story to help show people that, like, hey, listen, this isn't some lack of willpower or some, you know, deficiency with respect to character. This isn't a moral failure, right? And this is a disease, and this is part of the human condition. And I wrote this book to add my voice to the chorus of others who have also very openly discussed their addiction and alcoholism, in an effort to destigmatize this, you know, and maybe show people that there is hope out there. Not all is lost.
Yeah, I find it really interesting that there was such a gap in between the time that you got sober and that you wrote the book. I also wrote a memoir, but I wrote the memoir in the middle of it. And it was hard to write it in the middle of it. I cannot imagine going back and revisiting that 10 or 15 years later and then writing about it. Did it bring up a lot of stuff for you?
It you know, yes, it did, but not as much as you might think. There were I felt like I needed to have some sobriety under my belt in order to again, for me, you know, I mean, everyone can approach it differently, but for me, I wanted to have a little bit of time in recovery. One. Two, I held the job at Details Magazine for another 8 years after getting sober.
Yeah.
And so...
And they never knew in between?
No. I
That's
mean,
amazing.
they would have seen, you know, a dramatic change in me, and they would have absolutely noticed that I was more present and more responsive and less irritable, and I wasn't nodding out. I mean, I write a story in the book where I was interviewing someone to come work for me, and I was sitting there in my office with this guy. I'm holding his resume. He's answering some question that I asked him, and I nod out in the middle of that meeting. This was, you know, this is how bad things had gotten for me. But
you were taking an extraordinary amount of pills.
I was taking when I was taking Vicodin, and I ultimately changed to other opiates, roxicodone and oxycodone. But when I was taking Vicodin, I got to a point where I was taking 15 at a time, every 4 hours. I mean, I would do that maybe 4 times a day. So
As needed for pain, maybe?
As needed for pain, exactly. And the
Yeah.
pain was deep,
Yeah.
I mean, it really was. But I wasn't ready to tell this story. Then the details closed, and I didn't have to fear losing my job or anything like that, because even though when by the time details closed in 2015, I was sober for 8 years.
Yeah.
But again, still the stigma associated with addiction can't be underestimated. And I think we see now in 2020, particularly as we are in an election year, we hear a lot of talk about the opioid epidemic, and there are lots of addicts and alcoholics in recovery that are sharing their stories, and I think that that's wonderful. And people hear these stories and they're like, oh, that's so brave and so courageous, good for you, congratulations on your recovery. And that's all wonderful and hopefully for the most part genuine. But I still believe that inside their minds and maybe behind closed doors, there is still judgment passed on addicts and alcoholics. And so, even those with in recovery. So I came out of my career as a magazine editor at Condé Nast, and then I got to this point where I was like, you know what, like, I have something to say, I have stories to share, and hopefully my memoir can help someone that is either struggling themselves with this addiction or has a family member or a loved one or neighbor that's struggling with it, because this is sweeping across our country, and you don't have to look too far within your personal orbit of friends and relationships to find someone that has been touched by opiate addiction.
Right.
I think that's very true.
Well, to your question of the timing for the book, I mean, I wrote a book as well, and if I had written that book while I was active or right after I got sober, it would have been a totally different book. Because I would have been lying, glorifying, storytelling, embellishing. It would have been a mess. And, I waited probably 6 years before I started even considering it. And then like 7 before I put, pen to paper or, finger to keyboard, whatever. And still I had to keep going back because I caught myself in my old storytelling habits and behaviors where I had to go back and make sure I was telling the truth, or that I was coming from a place of like, there's a real message of hope here, not just telling glorified tales of my behavior. And it was definitely, I don't want to read the book written by an active addict.
No,
but I do want to read the book from a mom in the midst of it, because, I do want to hear about the pain that you might not want to go back and relive. And I want to hear about it raw, and I want to hear what you're doing. So your book
I was talking to my daughter the other day, and she said, every time I read this book, it gets me all over again. It gets me upset all over again. I said, well, stop reading it over and over again, for God's sake.
It's a book. You can put it down.
And she goes, well, you don't do that? I said, I've never read the book cover to cover. I've never done it.
I haven't read my book either.
Have
you read yours?
I read mine only by way of like proofreading.
Yeah,
same
thing.
Because there were, little typos and little things and so on and so forth. But I just want to say something to the moms, because I think that I write a lot about my mom.
I was going to ask you about that.
I do, and forgive me, because it's very difficult for me to talk about it without getting a little emotional. I grew up in a wonderful family, in a wonderful community, and wanting for nothing, and that's not lost on me. I understand that, and I'm very aware of the privilege that I've had, both as a child and as an adult. My mom was always a huge part of my life. And, earlier when I said, people started saying to me, hey, this isn't normal. Like, my mom, like a mother knows, right? She may not know exactly what's going on, but she knows when something is off, and mine certainly did with me. And I lied to my mother nonstop. I avoided her calls. I mean, I was grateful that I lived out of town because I didn't have to worry about any unwanted and unexpected knocks at the door. I think what addicts put their family members through is absolutely brutal. The challenge of family members and moms and dads and husbands and wives to figure out a balance between being firm and loving is incredibly difficult. My mother stepped up in such an extraordinary way when I was getting sober. I went down to her house in Baltimore where I grew up, and I withdrew, and I went through withdrawals, and I detoxed. I was there for 2 weeks, and she, for a parent to have to look at a grown child, I was in my 30s at the point, I was about to become a father myself, to watch someone go through that can be terrifying and heartbreaking. But boy, my mother, it's like I've never seen anything like it before. She was stoic and strong and graceful and loving, and she had always been loving, but I had never seen this other side of her where she watched it happen. She nurtured me, and it was just an extraordinary thing. And I will tell you, about 6 weeks after I got sober, I was back up living in New York. My mother came for a visit, and she looked at me and she said, "Oh my God, you're back."
Yes, I know that feeling. That's a beautiful feeling.
It's gotta be, right? So for all of the moms out there, for all of the dads, for all of the loved ones and family members that unwillingly take this extraordinarily crazy ride, this terrifying, death-defying ride, and stay strong and stay close. I just say thank you. I have a tremendous amount of gratitude to my own mom, of course, but thank you across the board, because without love and support, it's very difficult for an addict to find their way onto a path to recovery.
I think that's such an important message, because that message that's been out there for many years, if you got to cut people off and call me when you're sober, is such a destructive message. I mean, we can have boundaries, and we can and there are things that we shouldn't do as parents, but none of them is not showing love and support.
I couldn't agree more, Maureen. In fact, I could not agree more. And so I'm grateful that you just said that.
When I read you detoxed on your mother's couch, I was like, oh.
Yeah, listen, it's, I think that boundaries are incredibly important, as you just said. I think making sure that you're not enabling the addict in any way is incredibly important. And I think it's okay to be tough. The idea of tough love is a debatable one for me, if I'm being honest, because it can be defined in lots of different ways.
Yeah, we've taken it too far in the other direction, and
I think so. I think an addict, I think anyone, but I think certainly an addict needs to feel loved and supported. And listen, this isn't discounting the fact that families go through horrible things. They have things stolen from them. Families are destroyed over this, and I'm not minimizing that at all. But for me, the love that I was given by my family, the support that I was given by my family, and I'm incredibly blessed to have had it, and that's not lost on me, and I'm super grateful for it. But that stuff was a game changer for me. Right. And I've been asked since the book came out, by people who are dealing with active addicts in their life, what should I do? And I have said, listen, call them out on their behavior. Let them know that you are onto them. It may wind them up, and they may try to gaslight you and make it seem like you're the one that has a problem, but call them out on it, but don't stop being loving and supportive.
I'm glad you're preaching that message, because I think it's really important. I know after going through this with my own child, and I will tell you that once you're sober, you become magical and perfect again. It's like kind of like labor. Once we go through all that and it passes, a little while after it passes, we forget all about it. I don't even know what you're talking about. You weren't that bad. You were.
Right. Well, it's funny that you say that, because, here this book has come out, and my mother, who lives down in Baltimore, which is where I grew up, is a friend from high school ran into my mom the other night, and this friend sent me a message saying, I just ran into your mother. Oh my gosh, she's beaming about your book. She's so proud. And I wrote back to my friend. I was like, you would think that I just, was made partner in a law firm or something. Like, I actually just wrote a book about my drug addiction.
Yeah.
And my mom, is acting like, but of course, she's grateful I'm alive, as am I, right? Yep. Because let's be honest, we all know that this is a fatal disease. There are 130 opiate-related overdose deaths in the U.S. every day, and that includes heroin, and fentanyl, and all of that. And it's just absolutely brutal. So it is a miracle. It's a true miracle that I'm here alive, talking to you guys today.
Did you were you comfortable speaking right when you first got sober? Did you come out kind of explaining to people what you were going through? Did you hide it for a little bit? I mean,
I did. I kept my anonymity from most people for a while. My family certainly knew. Some close friends, maybe just 2 or 3, knew. And I ultimately, after a year or so, started to tell the occasional colleague, I'm not drinking, but it wasn't until I got a little further into my path to recovery that I started to feel more and more comfortable disclosing my status as an addict in recovery. This is an incredibly personal decision, right? And not anything that I would recommend doing if you really don't feel like you should do it. It's an anonymous. I mean, listen, if we're talking about, I'm very careful to talk about types of recovery, because there's not just one way to do it, right? And I think that's an important message also. There's not a single path to recovery. I will say that 12-step meetings are incredibly important in my life, and have been since I got sober. And so if you're in one of those meetings and you maintain anonymity, that can be incredibly important. For me, I got to a point where I was like, listen, you know what? Like, I'm proud of my recovery, and I'm sure everybody is. But I was in a position where I thought maybe, just maybe, sharing my stories can help people. And so I just said, all right, screw it. This is me, and I'm a drug addict. And I say that with neither pride nor shame. I state it as fact. But I do say that I'm an addict in recovery with a tremendous amount of pride.
I like that. And, the anonymity is not a requirement. It's an option. It's an option. It's an option set aside for people who feel uncomfortable, like you did in the beginning, to give you a safe place to get comfortable with what you're going through. But, people hold on to that anonymity, and sometimes that's what's killing, that there are not enough people that are comfortable coming out talking about it. And I don't just mean the steps. I mean all forms of recovery, like whichever one you're doing, that, I want to hear more about the recovery than I do the addiction.
Well, I mean, I think that that's a really interesting point, and that, I think, goes back to the way we as a culture view alcoholism and addiction and things like that, and I think it's incredibly important that we educate, and help make people understand, what's going on here, and for years, the pharmaceutical companies, would spend hundreds of millions of dollars on marketing. I'm sure they still are. And, obviously falsely minimizing the risk of addiction, right? We know that piece. But one of the other things that they really were trying to do, and likely are still doing, is get this sort of idea out there that it's really just drug-seeking people that are abusing these drugs, and that it's the people that are already high on something else and looking for a new high that are abusing these drugs, and that's just patently false, and we know that. But that message is out there, quite frankly, and I think it's really important to call bullshit on that. Forgive my language, and say, hey, look, like that's just not the case at all. And you know, these drugs, and there are people out there that need them and benefit from them, and I believe that they should continue to get them. I'm not looking to shut these companies down. I'm not looking to keep people who are desperately in need of these drugs with respect to pain management. I'm not looking to stop them from getting these pills. But I think it's really important to say that, you know, this epidemic which is devastating whole communities across the country, is impacting anyone and everyone. It is absolutely not just drug seekers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more.
I had this moment when the publisher delivered that first box of books, and I opened it up and I saw them all staring back at me of, oh my God, what did I do?
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Did you also feel like that? And were there people that didn't know that started to talk to you about this, or that maybe were, you know, shocked that you had even gone through this?
That's such a great question. So yes, so I have had, and I think at moments I'm continuing to have these, like, oh my God, what have I done?
Yeah. It's out there.
Yeah, you know,
everybody knows every single thing about you.
Well, and that's the thing, because, like, you know, and this goes back to the point you made earlier about not writing while you're actively using, because there goes the honesty right out the window, right?
Yeah.
So this is like, you know, rigorous honesty, if you will. And I dug deep, and I would also stop and say, okay, wait a minute, am I really saying this the way that it happened? And and so I wanted to be really true to myself, right? To thine own self be true. And so it was really important for me to tell an honest story. And honest in my case is also ugly, right?
Yeah.
So, like, I'm exposing all sorts of things that I'm happy to share these stories, quite frankly. But there are people, I have kids, my kids have school teachers, my kids have friends who have parents, all of these things. And I weighed all of that as I was writing it. And then when that box arrives, I opened it up and was like, gulp, here we go.
Yeah.
I am getting a lot of people reaching out to me, and I'm incredibly grateful for it. It's the most gratifying thing. Either that I know or don't know, just obviously saying thank you, and thank you for sharing your story. That's also my story. But I've also had people that I grew up with that I haven't spoken with in, say, 30 years come to me and say, hey, I'm in recovery too.
Mm-hmm.
And, or I've had moms reach out and say, we're struggling with my son. And I've had husbands reach out and say, we're struggling with my wife. And so it's an incredible thing that happens when you put yourself out there with a story like this.
Yeah. Well, you're doing a real service, I think, by letting people know that this happens in lots of different ways, and it can look differently, but it's basically all boils down to the same, potentially fatal disease. And it's frightening, and it's brave of you to do this. So we're going to have to close, but I'm just curious if there's one thing you could do to change things. If you're looking back and you see something kind of overall in society, even, or even personally, that you think we should focus on, what do you think that is?
That's a great question, and it's a big question, and it's a difficult question to answer. If I could change anything now, it would be perception. I think I'm a drug addict, and I am sober for 12 years. I'm a dad to 3 amazing, beautiful sons who have only ever known me as a sober man. I am an active member of my community. I have had a great career as a sober person. like, don't judge me and don't judge addicts. If anything, if I'm not looking for a pat on the back. I'm not looking to be congratulated, but just take a minute to understand that this is a disease, and for those that manage to survive and pull themselves through it and work toward recovery, and I say work toward recovery because it is incredibly difficult, and it's, there are people that will have slips and so on and so forth, and that's totally normal. Don't judge us.
Right.
I mean, it's as simple as that. Help us.
Yeah.
Offer help. Offer compassion. Offer empathy. But don't judge us, because you know what? Like, this is a human condition, like I said, and so if I could change one thing, it would be perception.
I love that. I love that. That's awesome. Well, thank you very much. And it's Dan Perez, and the name of the book is Needed for Pain.
As Needed for Pain, yeah.
And it's published by?
It's published by HarperCollins. And
so it's everywhere.
It's anywhere where books are sold. Amazon, absolutely everywhere. As Needed for Pain.
Awesome.
I love it. Thank you so much for joining us, Dan. I really appreciate it. And I will, I'm actually going to look forward to reading your book, because I want to hear the other side of this. And like I said, my experience is different. So I want to read about yours. So.
Thank you guys so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Take care.